Imagine waking up every morning knowing that 2,000 enemy soldiers are already watching your base, studying your patrols, counting your men, and waiting for the exact moment you step outside the wire. That was the reality facing the 108 Australians of Delta Company on the morning of August 18, 1966. By the winter of 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province had become the quiet epicenter of Australia's war inside South Vietnam. It was never the most populated or politically symbolic region, but geography made it decisive. Phuoc Tuy sat directly across the main Viet Cong supply corridors, running from coastal infill points deep into the inland base areas of Military Region 4. Control Phuoc Tuy, and you controlled movement, concealment, and tempo. At the heart of Australian operations stood Nui Dat, a deliberately austere forward operating base. No mile-long runways, no neon-lit sprawl like the giant American installations further north. Nui Dat was built to blend into the low hills and rubber plantations. Low silhouette bunkers, minimal lights, tight wire. It existed to support constant small unit pressure rather than project overwhelming power. The Australian method differed sharply from the American search and destroy doctrine that dominated headlines. Instead of large battalion sweeps backed by massive air and artillery, the task force relied on relentless, low-signature patrolling. A 5-kilometer exclusion zone was enforced around Nui Dat. Villages relocated, civilian traffic restricted, jungle flooded day and night with disciplined infantry and SAS patrols. Small teams, sometimes 4 or 5 men, moved silently through scrub, rubber rows, and creek lines, laying snap ambushes, watching tracks, lifting caches, killing couriers. There were almost no spectacular contacts, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Viet Cong supply parties vanished, couriers disappeared. Units that once moved freely now found familiar trails mined or ambushed. The jungle, once their sanctuary, slowly turned hostile. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army commanders, this erosion became intolerable. American operations were loud, predictable, and temporary. They arrived in force, burned villages, then withdrew. The Australians never withdrew. They returned to the same ground, learned every fold and track, remembered every abandoned cache site. Phuoc Tuy was ceasing to be contested territory. It was becoming Australian territory. By mid-1966, the decision was made in higher Viet Cong headquarters. Nui Dat had to be neutralized. Not harassed, not symbolically bloodied. Neutralized. The base was the nerve center, feeding constant pressure onto local main force and guerrilla units. As long as it operated unmolested, the Australians would keep bleeding the supply system dry. The plan that emerged was not another hit-and-run mortar stonk. It called for concentration of main force regiments, something the Viet Cong usually avoided in the face of superior Allied firepower. Regimental-sized forces would be moved into position, concealed for days, then unleashed in a single, decisive blow. The objective was clear: inflict catastrophic casualties on the Australian task force, shatter its aura of quiet dominance, and force a major operational rethink, or withdrawal. Unseen inside the wire at Nui Dat, the quiet war in Phuoc Tuy was about to detonate. At 2:43 a.m. on August 17, 1966, the night silence over Nui Dat shattered. More than 80 mortar and recoilless rifle rounds slammed into the base in less than 10 minutes. High explosive shells tore through tent lines, splintered sandbags, cratered the dirt airstrip, and sent shrapnel scything across sleeping positions. 24 Australians were wounded, none fatally. But the attack was never intended to overrun the base. It was surgical. Loud enough to demand a response, brief enough to allow clean withdrawal. Inside the wire, reaction was immediate and textbook. Counter-battery fire lashed suspected firing points. Illuminating rounds arced into the night sky. Listening posts and fire support bases registered the fall of shot and plotted back azimuths. By first light, patrols were already being tasked. The Viet Cong commanders had studied Australian doctrine for months. They knew exactly what came next. Aggressive follow-up patrols at dawn to locate mortar pits, recover base plates, cut tracks, pursue withdrawing crews before they could disappear. The bombardment was never about inflicting mass casualties on Nui Dat. It was bait, designed to pull a company-sized element out of the wire and into open country where the real plan could be executed. At first light on August 18th, Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment received the order. Major Harry Smith would lead 108 men, 3 rifle platoons, a small headquarters element, and attached signalers and medics on a sweep to locate the mortar firing points and any supporting elements. Intelligence picture was light. Scattered local force guerrillas, no indication of main force regiments in the area. Standard follow-up patrol. Expected return to base by last light. The men moved out through the wire shortly after 0700. Slouch hats, Owen guns, and SLR rifles slung low, webbing heavy with extra magazines, water, and grenades. No drama, no premonition. The mood was professional, almost routine. They had done this dozens of times before. Tracks were followed, sign read, small caches lifted. Nothing unusual. They pushed east, then southeast, following the faint drag marks and discarded litter left by the mortar crews. By late morning, the patrol had covered several kilometers. The terrain opened into the long tan rubber plantation, endless straight rows of mature trees, latex cups hanging from scarred trunks, wide grassy avenues between them. Visibility forward was good, sometimes 100 meters or more, but the geometric layout created deceptive angles. Flanks could be masked by just 1 or 2 rows of trees. Sound carried strangely under the canopy. The monsoon humidity pressed down like a wet blanket. Around 1500 hours, the first real sign appeared. Fresh mortar base plates abandoned in haste, still warm from firing, drag marks leading deeper into the plantation. The enemy had clearly displaced fast. Delta Company pressed on, 11 platoon leading, moving deliberately through the dripping rows. At approximately 1540, the contact began. 11 platoons sighted 5 khaki-uniformed soldiers moving quickly through the trees 150 meters ahead. Not the ragged local force militia the Australians expected. These men moved with drilled precision, regular North Vietnamese Army or main force Viet Cong. Weapons were raised. A short, sharp exchange of fire. The enemy group broke contact immediately and withdrew deeper into the plantation. Standard reaction: pursue. 11 platoon pushed forward to regain contact, following the withdrawal route. The rest of Delta Company closed up behind, maintaining tactical spacing. No one yet realized they had taken the first step into the killing ground. Beyond the tree lines, concealed in depth across 3 kilometers of plantation and bordering scrub, approximately 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops from the 275th Regiment, reinforced by D445 Provincial Battalion and local companies, waited in pre-prepared positions. Trenches, spider holes, machine gun nests, recoilless rifle pits, all sited to converge fire on the avenues between the rubber rows. Bugles and whistles ready, assault formations rehearsed. The Australians, 108 men, were advancing directly into the center of a regimental ambush that had been laid specifically for them. At 1600 hours on August 18, 1966, the monsoon broke over the long tan rubber plantation with biblical force. Rain fell in solid sheets, turning the red laterite soil into ankle-deep slick mud within minutes. Visibility dropped to 30 meters, then less. Water streamed off slouch hats, soaked uniforms, filled boots, and turned every movement into a laborious slog. Thunder cracked directly overhead. Lightning illuminated the endless rows of rubber trees in stark white flashes. Radio traffic hissed and popped with static. Shouted orders were swallowed by the roar of water on leaves. Then, the small contact exploded into something far larger. 11 Platoon, still pushing forward after the initial sighting, walked straight into the forward screen of the enemy main body. From concealed positions among the trees and low scrub bordering the avenues, disciplined bursts of AK-47 and RPD fire ripped through the rain. The 5 khaki figures had been bait. Now the real weight arrived. Within seconds, the platoon was pinned on a slight rise, barely 20 meters across. Enemy soldiers, hundreds visible in glimpses through the downpour, advanced in extended line, then in assault formations. Bugles sounded sharp and clear despite the storm. Whistles shrilled repeated signals. These were not harassing guerrillas. These were main force troops of the 275th Regiment, supported by D445 Battalion. Battle-hardened, well-drilled, and present in overwhelming numbers. Major Harry Smith, monitoring from company headquarters 400 meters to the rear, heard the sudden intensity on the net and knew instantly this was no skirmish. Reports flooded in. Heavy automatic fire from 3 sides. Enemy closing to grenade-throwing range. Casualties mounting fast. 11 Platoon's commander, 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, was killed almost immediately while directing fire and trying to maneuver his sections. Command passed to Sergeant Bob Buick, who rallied the survivors into a shrinking all-round defense in the mud. The rest of Delta Company, now down to roughly 90 effectives after detaching elements to secure flanks and casualties, attempted to fight forward to link up. Every move drew concentrated fire. The plantation's geometry worked brutally against them. Long, straight fire lanes allowed the enemy to pour enfilade from multiple angles while masking their own movements behind single rows of trees. Enemy numbers were staggering. Later estimates placed approximately 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops committed across the battlefield. Regimental strength against one understrength rifle company of 108 men at the start of the day. Waves came in succession, 20, 30, 50 men at a time, absorbing casualties but pressing relentlessly. Human wave assaults alternated with fire and movement advances. Grenades arced through the rain. RPGs cracked against tree trunks. The Australians answered with deliberate, aimed fire from SLRs and F-1 submachine guns, conserving rounds even as magazines ran dry. Men lay prone in the mud, firing until barrels glowed and extraction became difficult. Hands blistered on hot metal. Wounded were dragged behind the thin line. Dead comrades' pouches were stripped for ammunition under covering fire. The perimeter shrank meter by meter as fresh enemy companies fed into the fight from concealed assembly areas. By 1700, the situation was critical. 11 Platoon was isolated and being systematically enveloped. The other 2 platoons were heavily engaged, unable to break through to link up. Ammunition expenditure was ferocious. Some sections were down to their last few magazines. Enemy bugles sounded again. Preparations for a major coordinated push before last light. Major Smith made the call that defined the afternoon. Danger close artillery. He requested fire missions from Nui Dat batteries, 103rd and 105th Australian Field Batteries, plus the attached New Zealand 161st Battery, walked onto his own position. Forward observer Captain Maury Stanley, already under intense small arms fire, adjusted rounds in real time. High-explosive 105mm shells began crashing down within 50 meters of Australian lines, sometimes closer. Trees disintegrated. Rubber trunks exploded into splinters. The ground heaved. The curtain of steel tore gaps in the advancing enemy ranks and forced repeated halts. The artillery bought minutes, not hours. Ammunition continued to dwindle. Casualties climbed. The rain never eased. Delta Company was no longer conducting a patrol. They were fighting for survival against odds of nearly 20-1 in terrain that offered no defensible terrain features, no covered withdrawal routes, and no margin for error. The trap had fully closed. By 1730 hours on August 18, 1966, the Long Tan rubber plantation had become a killing field under continuous monsoon deluge. Delta Company's perimeter, now reduced to a rough oval no more than 150 meters across, held only because of iron discipline and the curtain of artillery fire Major Harry Smith was walking on to his own men. Captain Maury Stanley, the forward observer, crouched in the mud beside a radio operator, voice calm despite the storm and incoming rounds. He adjusted fall of shot in increments of 25 meters, bringing 105 millimeters high-explosive shells crashing down within 30 to 50 meters of Australian positions. Each mission was danger close. A single error in coordinates or wind would have killed their own. The batteries at Nui Dat fired without pause. Gunners worked in knee-deep water, shielding fuses under slouch hats, loading in rhythm. Shells screamed overhead, detonated in the tree canopy, shredded enemy assault waves, and filled the air with the acrid stink of cordite and burning rubber. The steel curtain halted repeated charges, forcing the Viet Cong to break off and regroup. But it could not stop them forever. Ammunition was the real killer now. Many sections were down to single-digit magazines. Soldiers fired semi-automatic only, conserving every round. When magazines ran dry, men crawled to fallen comrades, stripped pouches under covering fire, and passed ammunition hand-to-hand along the line. Grenades were counted carefully, bayonets fixed in anticipation of hand-to-hand. Casualties mounted steadily. Killed and wounded dragged to the center of the perimeter, medics working frantically in the rain with diminishing supplies. Enemy bugles sounded again through the downpour. Fresh companies of the 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion maneuvered into assault positions. Scouts probed the flanks. Machine guns raked the Australian line to suppress movement. The Viet Cong commanders sensed the end. One final coordinated push before last light would overwhelm the tiny force of fewer than 100 effectives facing roughly 2,000 committed troops. At Nui Dat, the task force commander recognized that artillery alone would not suffice. A relief force was ordered forward immediately. 3-troop, 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron, 10 M113s under 2nd Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, left the base under emergency orders. The carriers plunged into flooded creeks, engines roaring as water poured over hatches. Tracks churned deep mud, vision blocks fogged with rain. Enemy small arms fire cracked against aluminium hulls as the column fought its way southeast toward Long Tan. At approximately 1800 hours, the APCs broke into the plantation from the northwest flank. 50 caliber Browning machine guns opened up in long, sweeping bursts. Tracers arced through the rain, cutting down exposed Viet Cong infantry caught in the open avenues between rubber rows. The carriers charged directly into the enemy flank, heavy machine guns and .30 caliber weapons suppressing entire companies. Lacking effective anti-armor weapons, the Viet Cong assault formations disintegrated under the sudden weight of mobile firepower. Men scattered, some attempting to close with satchel charges, others breaking contact entirely. The armored vehicles punched through to the Australian perimeter just as the enemy's final wave began to falter. Delta Company survivors watched the M113s emerge from the gray curtain of rain like steel ghosts. The carriers formed a defensive ring around the infantry, turrets traversing, heavy weapons adding devastating weight to the line. Combined fire from SLRs, F1s, and vehicle-mounted Brownings shredded the last attacking groups. Faced with artillery continuing to hammer their rear areas, armor in their midst, and a now reinforced defensive position, the Viet Cong regimental commander ordered withdrawal. Under cover of darkness and unrelenting rain, the surviving elements of the 275th Regiment and supporting units melted back into the jungle, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded on the battlefield. The firing dwindled to sporadic shots, then silence, broken only by the drumming rain and the low rumble of idling APC engines. Delta Company had held. Against odds approaching 20-1, they had survived the trap. When the last echoes of gunfire faded into the rain-soaked darkness of August 18, 1966, the long tan rubber plantation belonged to the Australians. Delta Company, 108 men at dawn, had fought for more than 4 hours against an estimated 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops. They held their shrinking perimeter through disciplined fire, precise danger-close artillery, and sheer refusal to break. When the 10 M113 armored personnel carriers finally punched through the enemy flank at 1800 hours, the tide turned decisively. The Viet Cong withdrawal began almost immediately, melting back into the jungle under cover of night and continuing monsoon. They left behind hundreds of dead and wounded, abandoned weapons, and the shattered momentum of their regimental assault. The cost to Delta Company was heavy: 18 killed and 24 wounded, nearly 40% casualties in a single afternoon. Every man who walked out of the plantation carried the weight of friends lost and the knowledge that they had faced odds of nearly 20-1 and prevailed. At Nui Dat, the task force absorbed the battle reports through the night. Bodies were recovered at first light. The plantation floor was littered with spent brass, shattered rubber trees, and the grim evidence of close-quarters slaughter. Intelligence confirmed what the survivors already knew. This had been no local force skirmish. The 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion had committed main force strength in a deliberate attempt to destroy an Australian rifle company and break the task force's grip on Phuoc Tuy province. The strategic impact was immediate and lasting. For the Australians, Long Tan became the defining proof of their method. The quiet, relentless patrolling, the intimate knowledge of terrain, the willingness to fight at close range and call artillery onto their own positions. These were no longer theories. They had been tested against overwhelming numbers and held. U.S. commanders, accustomed to larger formations and heavier support, began to regard the Australian task force as the premier jungle fighters in Vietnam. The battle earned quiet respect across Allied commands. Small numbers, high discipline, unbreakable cohesion. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese commanders, the lesson was equally stark. Phuoc Tuy was no longer a safe rear area or transit corridor. The Australians would not be intimidated, would not abandon ground, and could not be broken by weight of numbers alone. Future operations in the province would require far greater caution. The cost of challenging Nui Dat directly had proven prohibitively high. Long Tan did not end the war in Phuoc Tuy. Patrols continued, ambushes persisted, casualties mounted on both sides. But the balance had shifted. The province remained contested, yet the initiative stayed with the task force. The quiet war of erosion had been answered with a loud, failed assault, and the Australians had answered louder still. In military history, some battles are won by maneuver, others by firepower, still others by morale. Long Tan was won by all three, but above all, by the refusal of 108 men to yield when everything said they should have broken. It became more than a battle. It became the standard.